PNP administration, the Riverton City dump has become a perennial problem. It is a public health hazard under the direct control and management of government. It is being managed by an agency set up to regulate and police waste disposal. There is an inherent conflict when the regulator is also the operator. The regulator should not and cannot police and regulate itself.
Keep quiet, you country boy.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I made sure to look at all the fires that have occurred. And yes, Mr. Speaker, yes, there were fires in our time, but the response was different. Yes, Mr. Speaker, there were fires in our time, but you know what, Mr. Speaker? They never lasted this long, and the effects of it never reached as far as this fire reached. Mr. Speaker, it is the policy of the Jamaica Labour Party to divest the dump to competent operators who are willing to make the necessary investments to create a green landfill. The dump sits on over 100 acres, has access to water, and is close to a port. These are further assets that can be leveraged in any divestment plan. As a properly managed landfill, apart from recycling, it should also have the prospect of being a waste-to-energy generator. Mr. Speaker, to facilitate interest in the Riverton City dump, a legislative framework should be developed to mandate separation of waste generated, firstly, from public, commercial, and industrial sources, and then followed by the phasing in of residential separation of waste. Mr. Speaker, my greatest fear is that the smoke that has been hanging over Kingston for the past week could contain cancer-causing particles resulting from the burning of electronic gadgets and batteries, along with numerous other potentially dangerous but unregulated chemicals which have been disposed of at the dump. Mr. Speaker, Riverton City and the Riverton City dump has its own special economic dynamic. It has an eco-dynamic, yes, environmental dynamic, but it also has its own economic dynamic. In other words, the dump and Riverton City interrelate. And I am aware that persons who earn their living from the dump would be fearful of privatization, especially if privatization means greater domain control and restricted access to the property. But we have a duty to let the people in Riverton City know that privatization will not deprive them of an income. What it means is that an industry in waste disposal, recycling, and energy generation could be established right in their backyard. This would give them meaningful and safer employment and better prospects for their children. It would also mean the improvement of infrastructure and a much better living environment. A JLP government will ensure that the people of Riverton City will benefit legally and meaningfully from the transformation of Riverton City, from the transformation of the Riverton City dump that could come from privatization. Mr. Speaker, in the meantime, And when I saw the fire raging for almost a week, and it is still raging now, still there, smoke is still billowing from the dump. I called some experts, some people that I know overseas in California, just to bounce off them. How would one contain such a massive fire? At one point it was reported that more than 60% of the dump was on fire, and that the firefighters were having a very difficult time. Certainly they would, because it is very difficult to try and to access, but to try and control a fire over such a wide range. And the suggestion was given that what you need to do firstly is to have airdrops of fire retardants, that you could go and contract with a plane that carries the fire retardant, flies over the dump, and drops the fire retardant. That would give the firefighters a better chance of bringing the fire under control in a much quicker time period. And I would recommend to the government that they go through the JDF or the fire brigade and explore this possibility of having a relationship, a standby arrangement, that should, in case such a fire happens, a fire of this magnitude, that your first response is to get that in, get the fire under control very quickly. Mr. Speaker, the government must always ensure that there is adequate stock of coverage material properly positioned at the dumps, and that piping systems and pumps are installed to take advantage of the river that is in close proximity to the dump. We cannot continue to have a dump in the middle of residential communities, Mr. Speaker, that emit hazardous chemicals and have numerous fires. We need to find, Mr. Speaker, in the future, a new location for the dump. And when we do find that location in the future, we must make sure that we create it from the start as a landfill. Mr. Speaker, this is the only way to move Jamaica from poverty to prosperity. Mr. Speaker, I wasn't really planning on getting into the economic arguments. Yeah, I wanted, because the social sectors have not been properly addressed, and I thought that I should focus on the social impact on growth. And so we made sure to deal with the cluster of health, education, and national security. But Mr. Speaker, I couldn't pass upon the opportunity. I couldn't pass upon the opportunity. Mr. Speaker, the propaganda of the government is that the IMF plan is working and will lead to economic growth. What we know from being on the ground is that it is not working for the vast